Hello. Welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. Pripyat. Once home to over 50,000 people, a city where mornings began with siren sounds, children's laughter echoed through apartment hallways, and lights never went out, even at night. But now, it had turned into a nightmare frozen in time. In April 1986, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant transformed the city into a living cemetery. As people were hurriedly evacuated, their meals were left unfinished. Teddy bears couldn't leave their cribs, and the last words written on school blackboards couldn't be erased. Everything had suddenly come to a halt. One morning, everything was normal. The next, the city was deserted. Over the years, nature began reclaiming the area. Trees took root between concrete walls, grass broke through the roads, and ivy crept in through broken windows. However, Pripyat was not an ordinary abandoned city. It wasn't just trees and rusted metal. This was a city haunted by the ghost of a disaster. As time passed, those who ventured there began whispering that something was hidden beneath the silence. Those who entered Pripyat at night claimed to have seen shadows moving between buildings. The carousel in the children's park, though no wind blew, slowly turned. Doors, left ajar, would close when no one was around. Radiation, as they called. It was invisible, but even the air here felt heavy, oppressive. Then, in 1997, a group of researchers entered the area. Officially, they were there to measure radiation levels and study the ecological conditions. However, they would soon realize that Pripyat was not just a dead city. When they arrived on their very first night, some couldn't sleep. Heavy silence surrounding them felt so stifling, it seemed like a suffocating smoke filling their lungs. But eventually, the silence was broken. At first, they heard the crackling sound of an old radio inside an abandoned building. It was as though something had started speaking again, after 11 years of silence. But there was no power in the area, and that radio should not have been working. The research team moved through the suffocating silence of Pripyat, their steps heavy. Rusted signs, faded propaganda posters, and buildings that seemed untouched for years. All of it reminded them that the city was frozen in time. But for Alexei, the team leader, this place was not just a research site. His father had been one of the residents of Pripyat during the 1986 disaster, and like thousands of others, he could never return. Alexei had heard stories about this ghost city for years, but had never truly believed them. As the team advanced, measuring radiation levels through the city, something caught Alexei's attention. Behind a crumbling building, surrounded by rusted wires, was a small structure. It was clearly once a radio station. Its sign was completely faded. But inside, there were still old Soviet documents scattered across tables and a massive antenna. But there was something else there that shouldn't have been. A faint crackling sound. Alexei approached the metal-cased radio resting on an old wooden table. Several team members followed him, none of them speaking, because they were all thinking the same thing. There was no electricity here. So how was this radio working? At first it seemed like static, barely audible to the naked ear. But when listened to closely, strange sounds could be distinguished, fluctuating at a weird frequency. Alexei fiddled with the radio's knobs, checked the antenna's connection, but nothing made sense. This device was a Soviet-era radio left untouched, rusting away for years. Then, something else mixed into the static. A voice, though muffled and deep, almost like a whisper. It sounded as if someone was speaking from a great distance. The words would disappear into the static and then return, sometimes faster, sometimes fading completely. The youngest member of the team whispered in fear to Alexei, "Is this a live broadcast?" No one could answer. The sound grew clearer. At first, only single words were heard. They sounded like meaningless random words. Cold, dark. Then, the frequency suddenly stopped for a moment. As the team exchanged confused glances, the radio suddenly crackled and trembled, and a clear whisper was heard. "Can you hear us?" No one could move, because the radio's frequency screen was turned off. When the knobs were twisted, there was no change. And in that moment, everyone felt the air inside become suddenly freezing cold. Alexei's skin tingled. The voice felt familiar. It was as if something, deep within an old, nearly forgotten memory, had resurfaced. The voice trembled again, and before it cut off, it whispered its last word. Alexei. This time, there was not only the voice but pain too. It wasn't a scream, but the last words of someone trying to survive. And at that moment, one of the team members claimed to have heard a sound coming from outside. But this was a completely abandoned city. Alexei and his team quickly began to prepare to record the strange signal they had found. They connected their portable recording devices to the radio, wanting to analyze every detail. However, solving the source of the signals would not be as easy as they had thought. When the device started working, at first all they heard was static. Among the noise, some words seemed to appear and vanish, as if a broken recording device was playing the same thing over and over. Meaningless letters, muffled hums, mechanical crackles. Some members of the team thought it might be a reflection of a radio wave from old Soviet transmission lines. But after a few hours, they noticed a distinct repetition in the signal. Through the hum of the radio, specific words began to emerge. The first word they heard was, "Can you hear us?" Alexei's throat went dry. The voice wasn't clear, but it repeated over and over with an unsettling echo. It was as if someone was calling from a distant metallic grave. A cold shiver ran through the team, but they needed a logical explanation. Alexei transferred the recording to the computer and began analyzing the waves. When they examined the frequencies, they realized that the voice didn't seem like a random radio signal. There were specific words that repeated at regular intervals. Soon, other sentences began to appear. Cold, dark, help. The voice grew clearer. It wasn't like a human speech rhythm. It was more like the voice inside a broken tape recorder, sped up and slowed down. But one of them noticed the strangest detail. These sounds could only be heard at night. During the day, the radio was completely silent. No static, no crackling. It was as if, at night, something in Pripyat woke up and was trying to say something. Dmitri, the quietest member of the team, spoke up in a hesitant voice after this discovery. Could these be alive? All eyes turned to him. No one wanted to voice this possibility. This could somehow be a recording from the past, or remnants of an old Soviet experiment. But Dmitri had another thought. What if the source of this signal was still here? What if something lost in the darkness of Pripyat was still struggling to survive? Alexei cleared his throat and tried to offer a scientific explanation. Most likely an atmospheric reflection. Radiation could make some old signals clearer at night. But his voice trembled. And the rest of the team didn't believe his explanation. Because, that night, while the recording devices were running, something else was heard within the signal. In the background, a muffled whisper, and for a brief moment, the sound of a breath. Someone or something was listening to them. Victor, the youngest member of the team, was quiet and curious. He was passionately devoted to science, but the mysterious signals in Pripyat had stirred a sense of unease within him that he couldn't explain. While everyone else offered different theories, he wanted to uncover the truth. If there was a source for this signal, he had to find it and bring clarity to it. At midnight, when the rest of the team retired to their camp to rest, Victor grabbed a small flashlight and went outside alone. The moonlight cast a pale glow on the ruined buildings' roofs, and silence enveloped the entire city. The only sound was the ominous creak of broken glass in old windows, shaken by the wind. But Victor heard something else within that hum. Whispers. They resembled the voices from the radio, but this time, they echoed in the air. It was as if someone from a great distance was calling to him from inside a building. The words were unclear, but in the cold of the night, though he knew he was alone, he could feel someone's breath. He quickened his steps. He had marked one of the abandoned buildings during the day to search for the source of the signals. It was an old radio building, once used as a communication center during the Soviet era. The Soviet seals on the door were still intact, though cracked and starting to peel. Victor pushed the door with gloved hands, and it creaked loudly on its rusty hinges as he stepped inside. Dust swirled into the air. The inside was dim, and there was a heavy smell of mildew. Old wires hung from the walls, and corners were piled high with files that hadn't been touched in years. But something caught Victor's attention. A faint greenish light was seeping from one of the rooms. He moved slowly, stopping in front of the door from which the light came. When he stepped inside, his heart began to pound wildly in his chest. Because, in the center of the room, on a desk covered in dust, was a radio that was working. This was impossible. Because the device wasn't plugged in. Because this building had been sealed for 11 years. From the radio's speakers, muffled, crackling, sounds began to rise. The whispers were unintelligible at first, but then they grew clearer. "Victor, don't go back." Victor's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn back, but something had pinned him to the spot. His legs were frozen, as if an invisible hand was holding him motionless. When he tried to take a few steps back, the radio's volume suddenly increased. Cold, dark. One of the panels next to the radio suddenly opened on its own. Inside were reels of old audio tapes, but written in pencil on the topmost reel was one thing. 1986. Last message. As Victor reached out to take the reel, he felt a movement behind him. Someone or something's breath was on his neck. He quickly turned around but saw nothing but darkness. And then, the light suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the room entirely. When the team realized Victor had disappeared in the middle of the night, they panicked and immediately began searching for him. They first checked the building, but when they entered, all the doors that had been opened earlier in the night were now locked. Still, they managed to find a way inside. When they reached the radio room, there was no sign of Victor. The only trace left was his footprints on the dusty floor. They searched the room for a while longer and eventually found something in the corner of the room. Victor's radio. The screen was cracked, and next to it, there were more footprints. But these footprints weren't coming inside. They were only heading toward the darkness. Victor never returned. As the sun cast a pale light over the concrete graveyard of Pripyat, the team reached the end of their hopeless search that had lasted all night. Victor was gone. His name echoed over and over. Every corner, every building had been searched, but no trace had been found. By morning, they realized they could no longer stay there. Everyone's face was pale, their eyes filled with both exhaustion and fear. Something was wrong in this city, and they knew it was time to leave. Alexei, as the team leader, made the difficult decision. They packed up their tents, placed the recording devices into their backpacks, and began walking toward their vehicles. Silence hung over Pripyat like a heavy fog. There were no birds, not even the sound of the wind. Only the sound of footsteps and the heavy breaths of people too afraid to even look at one another. Finally, when they opened the truck door, one of them turned back to glance at the ruins one last time. Victor. Where was he? Leaving him here, whether alive or dead. Accepting that was impossible, but no one wanted to stay any longer. The engine roared to life. The cold, rusty sound of metal filled the air. The wheels began to move slowly over the road that had been untouched for years. And then, at that moment, the radio turned on by itself. At first, there was only static noise. No one had touched the buttons. No one had adjusted the frequency. But the sound grew louder. Then, a familiar whisper echoed. Cold. Dark. The entire team froze. This was the exact same voice they had heard on the radio at night, but this time there was something more within the static. A breath. Someone, as if choking, was speaking through the radio waves, struggling to talk, and then the word echoed. Victor, don't come back. The driver quickly pressed the button to turn the volume down, but the radio kept going. Victor, you don't belong here anymore. Everyone's face in the vehicle turned pale as chalk. The driver floored the gas pedal, and they sped down the dead roads of Pripyat. The buildings passed by, the toppled electric poles fading one by one from their view. But the radio wouldn't stop, and then suddenly the voice changed. In the static hum, something muffled was heard. A scream, but not a normal scream. A deep, echoing, desperate one. It was Victor's voice. One of them couldn't take it anymore and covered their ears with their hands. Another clenched their teeth, trying not to scream. But Alexei kept his eyes fixed on the radio. Because Victor's voice was trying to tell them something, it was struggling to breathe. Heavy, deep, ragged breaths. And in between, there was a whispering word. Help. Then, the radio abruptly fell silent. Inside the vehicle, everyone remained as still as stone. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. But they were all thinking the same thing. Victor was no longer with them, but somehow, it was still with them. Years passed. When the team returned from Pripyat, they sought a way to explain what they had experienced, but no words could fully convey the terror they had faced. In the early days, they tried to make sense of the sounds they had heard. Perhaps it was some kind of magnetic echo caused by the radiation affecting electronic systems. Maybe the frequencies were accidentally replaying a recording from the Soviet era. But then they began analyzing the recording. Victor's voice was there. At first it was just static, but as they cleaned up the sound, words began to emerge from the background. Cold. Darkness. Get me out of here. The voice was occasionally muffled, as if struggling to breathe. Then a moment of silence. And then a very deep sound. A whispering voice. It spoke just one word. Here. At this point, the team could no longer listen to the recording. With a silent agreement among them, they locked the files away. No one would ever return to that area again. But the matter didn't end there. Years later, a strange rumor began to spread in the deep forums of the internet. Radio enthusiasts claimed they had picked up strange signals coming from the Chernobyl region while scanning certain frequencies. At first, no one took this seriously, but in 2007, an independent researcher named Andrei Petrov announced that he had caught a strange broadcast on the 462.55 Hz frequency at midnight. The recording was brief, but it clearly contained the sound of human breathing, and in the background, a sentence echoed, Victor, still here. After this event, enthusiasts began monitoring specific frequencies. The terrifying part was that these signals repeated at regular intervals, always at night, always at the same time. 01:23, the hour when the Chernobyl reactor exploded. Even today, some amateur radio operators claim to have caught signals from the empty buildings of Pripyat. Some believe that an old Soviet radio broadcast is still playing in an endless loop. Others believe it's the final cry for help from the souls lost there. But there is one undeniable truth. Even if no one listens, a radio is still broadcasting in Pripyat, and the voices within continue to echo in the infinite darkness.